Hi, hello, my name is Trina. Welcome and welcome back. Today, I wanted to go through every book I read in January, my full January reading wrap-up. It is a gloomy, rainy day. It's the perfect day to film something, even though that may affect the lighting, but we will see. Honestly, at this point, I'm kind of under the impression that Januaries are doomed to fail for me when it comes to reading. This is my second January in a row where I've been in the midst of a massive reading slump. I managed to bring it back. I read 8 books in January, which I'm happy with, considering the first half of the month I read 0. So the 8 books were just in the last few weeks of the month, so I was really proud of myself for bringing it back. I'm still low-key in the mood of like a reading slump where I'm really only in the mood to read really, really good books, and I'm being like super picky with books too, so there's only one 5-star book that I'm talking about today. But the rest of them are still pretty good, and I'm reading some really amazing books right now that will be discussed in my February wrap-up, so hopefully we are out of the midst of the slump for good. But for the full reading slump journey, I have to talk about the books that kind of started out the reading slump. And the first one should come to no surprise because I just finished a reading vlog where I finished reading this book, and that is The Well of Ascension by Sanderson. If you didn't watch the reading vlog, synopsis is I didn't end up loving this book, but for context, this is the second book in a fantasy trilogy, the Mistborn trilogy. The first book is The Final Empire that I read in December, and then I jumped right into The Well of Ascension afterwards because I really enjoyed The Final Empire. It wasn't perfect, maybe because I went into it expecting a perfect fantasy book, since that's what everyone online says, and I was kind of not disappointed, just was expecting a little bit more, so The Final Empire ended up getting 4 stars for me. But I went into The Well of Ascension expecting a similar caliber. This book basically takes place after the end of a revolution that occurred in book 1, and it's mostly political intrigue dealing with the political consequences to the more action-based storyline from book 1. I do like political intrigue in some cases, in most cases, but I ended up really not enjoying this book because, hot take, it read more like romantasy to me. Like, the crux of this book was really Vin and Elend's relationship, and the background relationships ended up taking up a ton of space in the story too, and I just wasn't a big fan of any of the romantasies in this book. Also, my favorite character from book 1 is not in this book, and I really felt like it suffered without him. Like, that, I realized that that's kind of where my enjoyment came from, and I didn't really enjoy how some of my favorite characters from book 1 changed in this book and how the perspectives changed. I also feel like this book exactly, I'm not speaking for all of Sanderson's books, but in the Mistborn trilogy so far, I feel like his attempts at talking about like political morality and moralization in this world, it feels very clumsy, it feels like the way it's written is like they're interesting topics, but he writes about it in a pretty clumsy way where the characters often like outright ask questions like, wow, I wonder why he feels comfortable killing those people. Wow, I wonder why I don't feel comfortable killing those people. It's not very subtle. That part didn't work for me very well either, but it didn't work for me in book 1 either, and I kind of overlooked it. But this one ended up just really, really annoying me. So I gave this book 2.5 stars. The last 150 pages, 200 pages of this is what saved it from being like a 1-star, 2-star read. It really picked up, so I gave it that extra half-star bump because I really started enjoying the latter half, and that kind of maybe helped me from this book fully sending me into a fantasy reading slump entirely. Like, the last 150 pages reminded me why I do like fantasy, but yeah. That was a long explanation. I feel the need for a long explanation, even though I already had a reading vlog on this, just because I know this is a lot of people's favorite book. That, if you want to see more, check out that vlog where I talk about it in more detail. The second book I read in like the reading slump portion of my month was actually an audiobook that ended up taking me like 3 weeks to listen to. If you don't know, I've mentioned this before on this channel, I really love a memoir on audiobook, especially narrated by the author, like listening to someone tell their life story. I love that as a concept. So I picked up an audiobook that was recommended to me by my local bookshop, by the people there, called Sigh by Phuc Tran. And I don't think it was bad by any means. It's not in my reading slump portion because it was like the cause of my reading slump or anything. I just was feeling very critical while reading this. I had finished Crying in H Mart 2 weeks earlier, so I knew how good, I was freshly off the wings of how good a memoir could be and how much it can make you feel. And I ended up just feeling like Saigon didn't focus on the right parts of his story. Like, I'm never going to say like someone's life story isn't interesting. He clearly had a very interesting life and he had a lot of important things to discuss. But it felt like this memoir got too caught up in Phuc trying to talk about punk rock and his interests as a kid and trying to create this setting that was very 80s. And that ended up taking up a lot of time away from the emotional beats of the story, which were his friends and his family. And without those beats, then it felt like something was really missing in the story. And also there were clear points, I felt when reading it, that it felt like whole scenes had been cut out, like had been edited out for the sake of space, that really impacted the story he was trying to tell and the emotional beats he was trying to tell. So I kind of wish whoever had edited this book hadn't taken out so much. I would have preferred a longer memoir to hit on all the notes he wanted to talk about. It's a pretty hard thing he's attempting to do with this book, both talking about his family and the experience of being an American immigrant, but also being a misfit and being into punk rock and creating this circle of friends in high school, but also falling in love with literature and being super into literature. I think that's actually quite a lot to fit into a memoir. It may not seem like it, but I think it is. So I think it probably could have used more time and energy. So I ended up rating this memoir 3 stars. Doesn't mean I didn't like it. I did like it. I was just being very critical this month, very careful. I do still recommend it. I just think there's other memoirs that do what he's trying to do in this one, but better. And then the last one in the early stages of the month that I was reading on my phone for the most part, because that was what was kind of helping me get out of my reading slump, I will say, was reading on my phone here and there, as opposed to like forcing myself to sit down with a book for several hours. And that was The Bridge Kingdom by Danielle Jensen. This book is a romantasy book for the most part. It is set in an alternative fantasy universe where a girl is married off by her father to the king of the rival empire, but she's been secretly training to be an assassin her entire life and a spy so that she can take down her husband's empire from within. And then obviously they fall in love. Shocker, and nothing is as it seems. Oh, none of that is surprising for romantasy. But I did actually really enjoy this book. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. I've read another book from Danielle Jensen, her new series, A Fading to Blood, which wasn't like the best thing I've ever read, but I really enjoyed it and I had a good time. And I like the way that she writes romantic dynamics, so I thought that I would like The Bridge Kingdom. I did. The politics side of things were a little bit clumsy, I would say, where that's where the star doc was. And also I wasn't super attached to the main couple because they were still like getting to know each other throughout this book. I know this is like a 4-book series. That's probably why it felt a little slower. Like they are still like connecting through this book. And I just like, I didn't super care about their romance, but I cared about them as individually as characters, which is why I enjoyed reading it. And I feel like I might enjoy the next books in the series, and I will read the rest of the series. So I actually had a good time with this one. The rating probably got more bogged down. Like maybe I would have enjoyed the romance better if I wasn't like in such a bad mood from the reading slump, but it is what it is. I gave it 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it, and I'll probably enjoy the rest of the books in the series too. Yeah, after that, I was on a quest to revive my love of fantasy. Not that I won't blame Brandon Sanderson and the Well of Ascension for killing my love of fantasy, but it definitely left a sour taste in my mouth reading an epic fantasy that I rated lower than 4 stars. I don't know if I've ever read an epic fantasy that I rated lower than 4 stars, so that was kind of a shock to my system. So I needed to revive my love of fantasy around the mid-month, and who better to do that with than one of my most trusted authors ever, Naomi Novik. I picked up her short story collection that came out last year, Buried Deep and Other Stories. If you don't know, Naomi Novik is a fantasy writer who's written standalone fantasy and a couple of series, and I've read everything written by her other than the Tremere books, which is next up on my list. There are just 9 of them, so it's a little bit more of a commitment to get into. But I've read all of her other books, so I know that her fantasy writing style really works for me. She has a very distinct voice, so all of her books and all of the short stories in this collection kind of sound the same, but I like it. Like, if you like the way that her writing sounds, then you'll enjoy the short stories. So I ended up giving this collection overall 4 stars because there were some duds in the early part of the book as I was like getting over my fantasy grumpiness. But near the end of the book, there were just like 5-star story, 5-star story, 5-star story in a row. And I ended up really, really loving some of them. They worked really well for me. I don't currently own this book, by the way. Like, I'll probably own it at some point, but the hardback version, side note, is so ugly. Like, it's like this canvas look, but the book itself is just plasticky feeling. Who decided that was a good idea? So I'm gonna wait for it to come out in paperback and then I'll probably buy it because I own the rest of Naomi Novik's books. So, side tangent on that. But I wrote down all of my 5-star stories in the collection. My 5-star stories were Buried Deep, which is an Ariadne and the Minotaur story retelling that I really love. I don't always love like Greek mythological retellings, but I think that Naomi Novik's like mythical style worked well for this story. It wasn't really what I would call a feminist retelling, but it was more about like a sibling relationship, which I love always. Then there was 7 Years from Home, which was a sci-fi short story in this one. A lot was going on in this short story. I don't really know how to explain it, but it focused mostly on environmentalism and like a fringe environmentalist group that was trying to merge with the environment of the planet they were on, while another group was trying to force them off that land in order to use it, while another planet group was just trying to incite war overall so that they could colonize everything. And I feel like it offered a lot of different perspectives on that kind of conflict, and like it felt too real, honestly. But really love that one. I would love to see Naomi Novik write a full-length sci-fi book. I would read the hell out of that. I would love that. And then there was The Long Way Round, which is the last short story in the collection and is supposedly, according to her note, is going to be the premise for the next book that she writes. So excited for that because I loved this short story. Gave it 5 stars. Again, love the sibling dynamics in this. I love the way she writes lead female characters. They end up having similar voices, but I love that voice, so I didn't mind it so much. And it's kind of a fantasy story about 2 shipfaring siblings who are trying to find a ship route for their goods that doesn't cross through the people taking tolls and doesn't cross through, like, it seems kind of boring, but like, it's very like mystical feeling, like nothing happens, but everything happens, and I really loved it. But my favorite short story in the collection, without a doubt, was Dragons and Decorum, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, but Elizabeth Bennet is head of the Dragon Corps in the British military, which if it seems ridiculous to you, it probably will be ridiculous to a lot of people, but if there's anyone on earth that I would love a Pride and Prejudice retelling from, it is Naomi freaking Novik. This short story had me like giggling and kicking my feet, almost like when I originally read Pride and Prejudice, which is like one of my favorite books of all time. So love this retelling. I had a really good time with it. Had a good time with the collection overall. I highly recommend Naomi Novik's books if you haven't picked them up, because if one of them works for you, then all the rest of her books are gonna work for you, and that's like the best part. She's very consistent. And then the other fantasy book I picked up right after that one was here. I still have my library books. They're very overdue. A Master of Djinn by P. Djèlí Clark. I liked this fantasy book a lot. It ended up being more steampunk sci-fi mystery than fantasy, but I picked it up because I wanted a fantasy book. I didn't mind the change in genre so much. I ended up giving this book a 4 stars. It's a really good book. I would probably have given it 5 stars if I had picked it up wanting a mystery steampunk book, like a steampunk mystery. As it was, I picked it up wanting something a little bit more fantastical, but the mystery is really at the core of this novel. It is like a detective novel, sidekick, police detective vibes in Cairo in the early 1900s, in a version of the world in which Djinn and magical creatures like Djinn are real, and they're trying to solve a crime that occurs in the first chapter. So I really liked it, but pick it up if you're in the mood for a mystery detective novel with fantasy elements and not necessarily like a fantasy book. And then ending off the month, I have my last category, which I'm calling my literary lady category, because I ended the month with 3 literary fiction books that I really enjoyed overall. The first one was a short story. Wait a minute, I think I actually have it somewhere. Let me go. I don't know where the hell it went, but I have, oh wait, there it is. Sorry, this isn't one of my books, actually. This is one of my mom's books that I was borrowing. I did give it to her for Christmas, and then she wanted me to read it too, so I actually read it before she read it, but this is my mom's book copy, and that is Small Things Like These by Keegan. This is a really well-known novella set in, I think it's 1990s? Yeah, 1980s. 1980s Ireland in a small town, and it deals with some of the abuses done by the church in Ireland that have only become really like public global knowledge in recent decades that were really horrendous. And it's sort of like the heart of this story as a man wanders through this Irish town living his life and sort of uncovers what's going on. I really, really like this. I did end up giving it 4 stars. It's more like 4.5. Like, it's so close. It was so good. It's probably 4.5 stars. I'll give this 4.5 stars. It's just that I know it's a novella, but I just don't know if novellas are for me. You know, I love 800 pages of a story that could be 400 pages. I just wanted a little bit more time in this world. Like, just in the moment when I was starting to really sink into the story and really get into it, it ends, which just upset me. But otherwise, it's so, so good. And if you like novellas, this is probably one of the best ones I've ever read. It was really, really incredible. And I like Claire Keegan's writing style. So going into Claire Keegan's other books, I'll keep in mind that they're novellas and stop and like get more attached in the early parts of the story so that I can enjoy it better. But I think it's a 5-star novella. It was like a 4.5 star reading experience for me. But yeah, really, really enjoy this. I highly recommend it. And then my second to last book of the month, I read Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. And as for context, my sister's favorite book is Homegoing. So it's very much on my list of books to read very soon is Homegoing by Gyasi. But first I wanted to read Transcendent Kingdom, which I heard like my sister didn't like as much. So I was like, I'll get this book done first and then I'll read Homegoing afterwards. And I really love her writing style. This was a really beautifully written book, like literary lady for real. Like it was so well written. But I did end up giving this 3.5 stars, like a positive 3.5 star rating. I think what happened? I think it ended up being for me like this story doesn't really go anywhere. For context, this is about Gifty, set both simultaneously kind of in her childhood and in her adult life, as she deals with the consequences of the fact that her brother died from a drug overdose in her childhood. She was like 11 years old, which is said in the cover of the book. It's not a spoiler. Her brother dies from a drug overdose, and she was raised in very, very religious, and this sort of like shatters the foundation of her faith in the world. And by the end of the story, that is still the plot of the story. Like, I don't think it's a bad plot, it just doesn't go anywhere. I don't feel like Gifty really grows as a character. And there's just a lot of like preaching about religion in this story without dealing with a lot of like the really harmful things we see depicted. And she never really grapples with those things. She kind of stays stagnant as a character throughout the book. Like I said, it was really beautifully written. I like a lot of the passages in here. And I overall liked the first half a lot. I just felt like it became very repetitive. We got sort of told the same things about Gifty's life over and over again. But it has reaffirmed to me that I think I'm gonna love Homegoing because I do love her writing style. So that's next up on my literary reading list. And then I saved the very best for last. Technically, this is not a literary fiction book, but it is a literary non-fiction book. And this is the only 5-star book I read this month. And that is Bitch on the Female of the Species by Lucy Cooke. This is a non-fiction evolutionary biology book about tracing myths of like female animals in the wild, females in evolutionary biology theories, and presenting new findings, new research, new data that a lot of people aren't familiar with because it's like from the last 20 to 30 years, and sort of destabilizing old and debunking old myths about misogyny and patriarchy in evolutionary biology. If you're going to read a nonfiction book this year, read this nonfiction book. Also, I listened to the audiobook. Love her narrator voice. It literally feels like you're listening to a nature documentary. Lucy Cooke has this like really fun British accent, like she's narrating like Love Island or something. Like she has a very like fun British accent that takes a second to get used to, but then at the end really feels like she's narrating like a Netflix like nature documentary to you. I want the live action adaptation of this book. Genuinely, it was so good. Even if you're not a nonfiction person, I think, and like, even if you think you don't believe in any myths in evolutionary biology, this book just meant the world to me in terms of what she talks about with matriarchy in the wild, and a lot of like the poorly done research that was mostly done based on confirmation bias in male evolutionary biology spaces for 100 years. And with a great deal of love and respect towards Darwin, she builds up a new understanding of his theory that isn't like questioning what we've discovered so far, but it is accurately using what we've discovered so far in the right ways and not cherry picking data to sort of apply human ideas of gender and place them onto animals. So I just thought it was really, really, really well written and really interesting. And I feel like I'm selling it poorly. And I'm not like, I don't know if I'm explaining how much this book meant to me. Like a chapter into the end, and she's talking about like the anemone fish and the ability of animals in nature to change sex, and that sex is not a stagnant thing, even in like biology, even in science. And the way that she also talks about science as a socially generated field. Like science is not somehow this separate holy thing above society and sociology. It is embedded in those things because it was an invented field. Like science is also created by people, therefore it is also a social force. I guess I knew that, but I've never heard someone say it in the way that she does. Reading this really feels like someone's like the magnum opus of evolutionary biology. Like, I'm being so serious. This meant so much to me. Yeah, I'm gonna be re-listening to the audiobook, rereading the book. Overall, I loved it. I highly, highly recommend it. First 5-star of 2025 was Bitch on the Female of the Species. Yeah, overall, incredible book. Incredible way to start my year. I loved it. It might be my new favorite nonfiction. Somewhere up there with Entangled Life and a couple of memoirs. So, amazing. But yeah, those were the 8 books I read in January. I talked about them a little bit longer than I usually do because I only had 8, so I could go into more detail. I hope you enjoyed. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so, so much. I'm hoping to read more in February to have more to talk about, but some months are just slower reading months. You can't do anything about that. It is what it is. Please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, whatever you want to do. And I will see you in the next video in February 2025. Toodles.